you've been paying attention to World Championship coverage, you've probably noticed the overarching narrative that the bloodthirsty teams, the ones that are very proactive, the ones securing first bloods, are the ones coming out on top in the quarterfinal.
Towards the bottom lane, and now it's going to be a massive 3v3. Mata in some trouble, taken down below half HP. Jackie Love also going to be taken very low, getting the first.
They're already making their move. The Flawless
That's
a good stun. Vanguard's edge bounces in, but Perkz is left alone. He's left to dive, manages to pick up first blood, traded back with Corsa. It's a 1-for-1 in the top lane.
Late last year, it's mid lane.
The flash in the mid lane going for Kuro right away. He can't get away from the chain. Ignite is on, and first blood for Jensen under 3 minutes.
And then there's the Fnatic series.
Meanwhile, around the red buff.
All right, Paul Bryce comes down from Hilly, saying an engage from Haru. The knock-up will catch up to Hilly. He's got flash available. Flashes over the pit. Here comes Haru. First blood picked up by Scout. And
yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. I'm not really here to debate the consistency of the power of this narrative or whether or not it's accurate or whether or not there are other factors that are leading to these victories. I'm here to talk about Fnatic and whether or not their early game in the Edward Gaming series was bad, because I would say over all of the teams and over all of the games that we saw, the Fnatic Edward Gaming games were the odd ones out in a lot of ways. For one thing, you don't have the second seed team coming out on top. You have the projected winners actually succeeding overall. For another thing, you have the issue where Fnatic are playing kind of a slower pace game. They're playing more for some of these team fights. They're making a lot more mistakes, giving up more kills early overall. Obviously, IG didn't completely stomp all of their early games. Obviously, G2 didn't completely stomp all of their early games. Obviously, C9 didn't get every single early game first blood in their series, but it feels like Fnatic are the ones kind of losing out in kills more, and this is a perfect time, this is a perfect way to discuss a topic that I've always kind of been championing or kind of been concerned about, which is what actually makes a good early game.
Okay, so this is a debate between Kelsey
Stop. Turn it off. What did I do to deserve this? But yes, in seriousness, I've always sort of felt like the way forward against this indomitable LCK giant, against teams like SK Telecom, against teams like Samsung, was to focus a lot more on laning prowess, and obviously there have been alterations in the meta that made a lot of that stuff more viable going into this tournament, but this is something that I wanted to talk about a lot. And when Fnatic come up, a lot of people are wondering, okay, with how aggressively Cloud9 played their game against Africa, is that a concern for them in the semifinal? So we will look at kind of some of Fnatic's early game decision making in the Edward Gaming series and discuss why their early game actually wasn't so bad. And there are a lot of instances where, even though Edward Gaming came a lot ahead in kills, I actually felt like Fnatic had a better game plan going into the early game, played more to their compositional strengths, and for me, they kind of played the way that I wanted Africa to play against C9, so it could be interesting to see these teams match up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first game. I think we can all agree that there are major problems in both setup in terms of how their composition is drafted and the way that the game played out. Obviously, Fnatic went for something like a last pick jungle, a last pick Elise into the Xin Zhao. You're going for something that should play very aggressively with lanes that aren't necessarily going to get a lot of pressure overall. I think that just kind of doesn't work. In general, Elise doesn't have a lot to do. He's not going to be 1v1ing Xin Zhao. He's going to be 1v3ing Xin Zhao in a lot of cases. So, and then, of course, you have a little bit of issues in jungle pathing where he goes for Raptors when he knows that there's an opportunity for Haro to rotate off of blue buff and gank again on his Krugs, and he should be valuing the Krugs camp a little bit more in this scenario. So just all of the early execution here was problematic, but the way that Fnatic bounced back is something that I think is really interesting and something that's worth discussing in more detail. Fnatic's biggest adaptation in my mind comes in the draft phase because they go for the Braum much more early on. I think that Braum is actually probably the biggest pick for Fnatic in general. It has a really strong level 1, it has a really strong defensive setup for their bottom lane and a lot of the picks that Reckless likes to bring out, and also has opportunity to often get first back, move mid, make sure that they counter any sort of offensive moves onto Caps' lane and help get Caps ahead a little bit. So I really liked that being picked up. I really liked them going for their jungler earlier on so that they could have a better idea of how their composition played out in a whole. I think overall this is probably Fnatic's best early game in the entire series. They are placing some defensive vision on their bottom side. They are playing more aggressively into the bottom side, knowing that they have a really strong level 1 with Braum selected, so that you're not going to be in a position where Edward Gaming can crouch in on their red buff, can disrupt their jungler's start, and in general, they make sure that they're constantly looking and constantly being aware that they can control this river, forcing out Scout's flash and getting an advantage early on. Aside from that, top lane and bottom lane are going to really matter in the way that Haro makes a lot of these decisions, and you see, first of all, on the top side that Ray is giving Haro a leash. This creates an opportunity for Bwipo to get to lane first, obviously, to really kind of control how this lane goes. And obviously Bwipo is going to push regardless, but if he's able to get a ward down, if he's able to approach the wave first, he really has an easy way to sort of start a slow push, to start stacking the minions. And Haro is going to do a defensive start where he gets red, he gets Krugs, make sure that he's able to kind of keep competitive and experience as Broxa is able to go through the bottom side, use the pressure created by Reckless and Hylissang, and deny him his blue buff. So as a result, Haro is in kind of a tricky position. He first goes for the Scuttle, which is going to be helpful for his team, but he knows that if he's invading on this top side, if something should happen such that he needs Ray's backup, Ray can't do anything unless he wants to lose this huge stacked creep wave that Bwipo is building for him. So there's not really a good way for Haro to invade, and then of course you have Broxa putting the blue ward on the blue buff just in general to keep that protected, to make sure that they're aware of whatever moves EDG makes. Instead, Haro goes for this gank. Bwipo is prepared. Obviously, he has to burn his flash, but Ray cannot get back control in this lane, and this is a really good start for Fnatic comparatively. You have Broxa able to get the 3 buff this time around. Obviously, this isn't the perfect Fnatic early game. There's still the manner of the bottom lane dive. And this is where we get into the meat of the discussion, because you have Haro continuously forced out of his jungle by Broxa looking to make something happen, looking to force something on this side of the map where he has the Alistar and he has quite a bit of agency. It's just something that EDG love to do. And obviously Fnatic do make some mistakes here, but I think this comes down to how they're approaching the minion wave. You have Scout here staying mid, pushing out the wave, while Caps gets the Scuttle because Caps was able to roam freely off of this priority. Caps now has to go back to lane, and this is where EDG choose to engage. This is where EDG choose to look for something onto Reckless. And Broxa comes down defensively to deter any more forward aggression while Caps answers this wave. And I think this is where, you have Fnatic miscalculating a little bit, because Edward Gaming are not just really fast shoving this wave to set up for this dive. Instead, what they're doing is they're kind of thinning out the minions, and they're waiting for an opportunity for Scout to move before they can conduct this. And Fnatic misplay a bit here, but I think overall they just don't expect Scout coming down. It's a little bit weird, because obviously they see him clearing out the pinks a little bit early on, which was smart from Edward Gaming, but going for this play instead is really questionable. And I think part of that just comes from look at the minion wave in the mid lane. Caps is able to push out all the way. Edward Gaming know that they're going to invest a lot of time from Scout to conduct this play, and the wave will probably bounce all the way back for Caps. So if you're Fnatic, if you're Edward Gaming, what do you care about a little bit more here? You have a Sivir versus a Kai'Sa. Both of these champions scale very well into the late game. And then you have an Aurelia versus a Galio. Is Fnatic, I think you care a little bit more about getting your Aurelia ahead than getting your Sivir ahead, who will kind of scale passively, because you want a good bridge to the mid game. And as you're looking on the top lane, Edward Gaming even decided that, we have the ability to make this play, partly because the teleport advantage that Bwipo once had by being able to push out the wave is gone as long as he's low mana. You have an option for him to continue to push the lane, continue to get pressure, but that's going to be in Fnatic's favor. So Edward Gaming, kind of desperation, look for the option to force her on bot. Good for them, it comes out ahead, but what they have to give up for that, just in terms of the priority that top lane and mid lane are getting off of this, by having Ray and Scout come down here is going to be very Fnatic favored, because Edward Gaming are basically saying that now we're all inning on Kai'Sa. All we have is the super late game Kai'Sa, and if Kai'Sa doesn't snowball out of control and get huge leads on Reckless, we're not going to have a game plan. So I think that actually, even though Fnatic end up losing kills here, this is super good overall for their solos. Bwipo, who had run low on mana, has the option to back now, and you're really going to see a lot of opportunities for Fnatic come out well as the game progresses. This game really has the crux of what I'm getting at here, which is looking at both compositions, deciding what the win conditions are, and how teams want to have the games played out, how they want to have the early gold distributed across their team, and not just looking at who gets the most kills, who gets the most X, because I think that a lot of people will say that if you're losing ground in the early game, you have a bad early game. But a lot of times you can't really make up for that. You can't really control for that, because you can't go into every game saying we want a winning lane here, a winning lane here, a winning lane here, and a winning jungle, because first of all, unless the enemy team is insanely incompetent, you likely won't get that. Second of all, if that's your only concern, you probably don't get a balanced composition. So you can have a composition that has a lot of power in the early game, but probably still won't have that be the only dimension. And if you do draft like that, that's probably not a good approach in general. I already talked about my issues kind of with Cloud9's draft in the Africa game. I think if you look at Fnatic's drafts and the way that they conducted themselves throughout their series, I think they were a little bit more mindful of how they wanted their compositions to play out, excluding game one. And so overall, I would say that Fnatic actually had better early games, even when they went down in gold, even when they lost kills and their players died to ganks that they shouldn't have. I would say that I think their early games came out ahead. And let's look at the last two games to see if I can kind of make my point and convince you. Again, in Game 3, you have a situation where Fnatic will probably not have super good priority in early levels. You have the Tahm Kench adaptation from EDG into the Braum. You have Poppy that's able to usually get pretty good push with Q, obviously with more levels in W and getting the CDR from the Frozen Heart. Then you have a situation where Ornn will be able to answer the lane and push pretty competitively after an initial back. But Poppy obviously going to do fairly well first few levels, Edward Gaming going to have good pressure. So instead what Fnatic do is that they have Bwipo start from bottom and walk up, and since they aren't really leashing for their jungler, they're in a situation where they probably assume or figure that they're not going to lose a whole lot compared to how Edward Gaming have been playing the initial games. Brock's also making sure he secures the scuttle, making sure he secures both of his buffs so he doesn't end up in a situation where he's losing some early game power on the Xin Zhao to the Camille. Now, obviously, we have what we expect in this mid lane matchup with Scout pushing up really early into the Yasuo because the Syndra has a ton of range and just can sort of freely Q. Yasuo shouldn't really be able to approach his creeps, since Scout should be able to build up, 2 waves to crash into the enemy side of the map. He should be able to kind of punish and harass caps under turret and get a slight advantage there. You don't really see the Yasuo coming online until he can all in at level 6, and he'll have the option of being able to split push, being able to do something along those lines. You have Broxa coming in here, and I think this is very good, and this is where we see Fnatic really kind of understanding their win conditions, because he's forcing Scout back. He's giving Caps some breathing room so he doesn't lose all of the next creep wave, he can walk forward, and he doesn't end up severely behind. This is something that Xin Zhao really needs to do because their composition relies a lot on this Yasuo to be able to get picks as the game progresses, and so that they're not just reliant on their Sivir to snowball and their engage from the Ornn. And I didn't really mention this in the clip, but the fact that Fnatic are prioritizing having their totems in the pixels by mid lane, the fact that they want to make sure that they have vision around mid so that the lane doesn't get really bad for caps early on shows smart foresight and just a good understanding of what they need to happen in order to make this game work. Prior to Brox's first back, you have him shadowing bottom lane. You have some vision over there that allows Fnatic to play up. They're looking for an opportunity to get a good back for Hillsong and influence the mid lane, which is something that Fnatic love to do. It's a little bit of an underrated aspect of their team play. Edward Gaming reacts to this. They see that Sivir is backing. They assume that they want to be able to match any kind of mid lane play, especially since we're having the events happening right now, which is Scout looking for back, right? Haro went to shadow the lane and backed himself to get the reset off, but Scout wasn't able to back. He had kind of a greedy back position. Broxa is putting more vision around the mid lane to give Caps more of a safe laning phase, and the coordination that we see coming out of Fnatic in order to ensure control of this mid lane is just much better, because obviously you have vision of iBoy coming back solo to the lane down here, so Broxa, even though he's kind of doing a veer, you could think that he's going to look to just help Broxa with jungle vision and go back bot, but he decides to head directly mid, because again, you have vision of Mako coming up the river, you have iBoy being solo on the bottom side, and they want to be able to match any kind of play that Edward Gaming make pre-support level 6 and make it much better for Caps. And again, Edward Gaming are attempting this, so looking for this, but the coordination coming out of Fnatic is just making this mid lane go much better than it should be. Caps is hardly down CS, Scout isn't able to get backs, and even though he doesn't lose those waves, he, initially at least, he's not really able to make anything happen, so he kind of has to just cut his losses here and back out. You have Ray coming in, sort of a desperation clear going on, looking for something, but again, it's just not as much finesse. Fnatic are not losing the waves and the creeps that Edward Gaming are from these plays, and it's in general going much better in these early phases of the game. Obviously there are a lot of misplays from Fnatic and a lot of issues overall, but even when Edward Gaming have this kind of forward momentum, they're not getting a ridiculous lead in terms of just objective control and in control of the game in general. And this is where we see Fnatic's setup shine a bit more, because obviously EDG just backed. We just saw EDG back here. Let's take a look at the minimap and what's happening and what's going on. Arguably, EDG shouldn't have gone for this mid-tier 2 here. They should have kind of left the Rift Herald after the first tier 1. It would have gotten some chip damage on this turret, and then they could have gone in here and cleared out this vision and had time to back, reset, and go through. Because they commit so much to this, and then they just keep pressuring on, Edward Gaming don't have a lot of agency. They lose tempo in the next play. Part of this comes from Scout having to catch this wave here. Part of this comes from the late reset that I already mentioned, where Edward Gaming aren't able to clear out these wards, aren't able to refresh and get vision and set up so that they have momentum and can continue threatening on this set. They have to reset the side waves, they have to do all of that. And then Fnatic now just are perfectly set up, perfectly in position, such that they can easily trade this mid-tier 1. And honestly, at this point in the game, the mid-tier 1 is so much more important than a mid-tier 2. You don't care that much about losing your mid-tier 2. The mid-tier 1 is going to be the one that sets up for the dragon, or excuse me, the Baron as it spawns in a minute and a half, and that's really all you care about mid lane wise. But at the same time, Fnatic already have this bottom tier 1 gone. That's extremely good for them relative to Edward Gaming, because if they want to have any kind of pressure from the Yasuo in a side lane, that's helpful, or from the Ornn. That's not really what their comp wants to do, because they're against a Tahm Kench and a Camille, which makes it a little bit difficult to have a really hard, heavy pressure there. But they want to be able to set up lane priority, to be able to play for this next Drake, and to be able to have some kind of pressure when the Baron spawns, because that tier 1 bot lane turret matters actually way more than a tier 2 mid lane turret. Now, obviously, I'm not arguing that Fnatic's early game 3 was pristine and perfect, but I think that they had a better idea overall of what they needed to happen, how to execute that. There seemed to be better communication in terms of just setting up for a safer phase for the Yasuo, and Edward Gaming didn't really transition any of their leads that they had there into good vision control. Like, Fnatic were almost always able to maintain good wards, and that allowed them to get tempo every time EDG overextended in a play and make a really good answer return. So for me, I actually look at this and I think, well, sure, Fnatic aren't perfect, but they're thinking about this more, and it seems like they're a little bit further ahead in thought process relative to Edward Gaming. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Game 4 because this video is already almost 20 minutes, but I want to just highlight a point I made earlier about just understanding your win conditions and how your compositions will play out, which I think this game really illustrates well, because on Fnatic's side you have Nocturne, on EDG's side you have the Lee Sin. And you have an aggressive play coming out from the bottom lane, the summoner spell advantage for Edward Gaming, and now Haro has a couple of options to consider, and I don't necessarily agree with the choice he makes. I talked about in the first game how it was good for Haro to look for that gank there, because it's really easy for him to be in a position where he's invading against priority and he's losing a bunch by contesting blue buff. Here you could think something similar, but there's no way that iBoy isn't going to be able to push out this wave in advance so that Fnatic can't really interfere. Mako's going to have a lot more of an influence than a summoner spell-less Hylissang, who probably can't really walk up in order to help Broxah defend this buff for himself. So a lot of it will come down to the Syndra LeBlanc lane. Syndra should be able to push pretty effectively, so getting this first blood looks really good on paper for EDG, but you're not punishing this Nocturne. Nocturne is still going to be able to have an impact on the game, and when you look at this and you see the fact that, you know, you have Edward Gaming's Kai'Sa, who's going to scale up really well and do good against the Xayah eventually anyway, that's not really what you should be prioritizing here. You should really be prioritizing keeping the Nocturne down. So for me, I don't really agree with this move by Broxah and Haro, and I don't think it's particularly good. And as long as Broxah is able to keep farming on his Nocturne, I think that Fnatic are pretty happy overall with this. Theoretically, you don't want to lose first blood, but it's fine that this is happening and your Lee Sin is getting the kill on Edward Gaming instead of Fnatic losing out on Nocturne's ability to eventually be able to impact the game, particularly the mid lane. Obviously, you have Scout getting a solo kill onto Fnatic, but again, I feel like Fnatic are much more proactive in terms of when they want the wards to get down. Being able to understand and identify when Haro is on the map so that they make themselves aware of when they can play for objectives. And I mean, Edward Gaming gets to this point in this game where they're just not very far ahead in terms of overall map play, but they are ahead in kills, and this is a big determining factor in terms of why that happens. For example, in this part of the game, you can't really see Haro impact a whole lot on the bottom side of the map just because of the careful ward placement that Fnatic have, that EDG don't really spot out or don't really identify, specifically looking at this part or this area of the game plan. So Fnatic don't walk forward in this lane, they don't try to go for that last hit because they know that Haro is really in place. So even though they have this pink in the lower brush at this point, Fnatic have kept a better tab or a better identification on where Haro will play out just based on where they put their pinks. Like the deep wards that they have, that has really just given protection not only to their bottom lane but to their jungler to be able to continue to farm up, to be able to look for the level 6, level 11, etc. spikes that Nocturne will have on a game like this. You see Fnatic's bottom lane rotating to reset when Fnatic's jungler on the top side of the map. These types of situations are a bit rare for a lot of teams on the top side, but even beyond that, right? You see Edward Gaming rotating now to try to make something happen with Ray in the Sion versus Swain matchup, because obviously Swain can get pushed. A lot of it relies on whether or not he can land his E. He does a lot of percentage health damage as the game progresses, but you can still make this a bit of a skill matchup overall in terms of how the Sion plays out the lane, and Scout is playing to that effectively. But Fnatic observe this, they decide to rotate, and they look for trades on objectives, in this case Dragon. And obviously it's a Cloud Drag, we don't care that much about the Cloud Drag, but if you have a composition with a LeBlanc and a Swain, something that will want to sort of match champions and side lanes as the game progresses, Cloud Drag actually works very well for you. It's very important to your composition, so it's a bit of a foresight to say that, you know, we can accept this trade, this is a good trade. It'll be good for our LeBlanc, it'll be good for our Swain, it'll be even good for our Xayah. So hopefully I've kind of hammered in where I'm coming from on this. Either I have or I haven't. You have a lot of instances where I feel like Fnatic make better trades even if they make mistakes. They react to their mistakes very well. They react to where Edward Gaming wants to enforce pressure. They have really good boards, and they really understand this concept of resetting or making sure that you can trade for a play if a team overextends and doesn't clear out the vision, doesn't reinforce their position before they reset. So for me, Africa make a ton of just random mistakes, but one of their biggest issues overall is just not really reacting or understanding where Cloud9 would go to pressure, and I feel like Fnatic do that very well. So when you're talking about what makes a better early game, not considering that or thinking that Fnatic's early game's poor because they're not jumping on everyone and getting 3 kills super early on, ignores the fact that Fnatic can kind of eke out the enemy team in terms of farm out certain carries and also in terms of how they want their composition to play out and objectives, just disregards what a good early game should be. What a good early game should be is identifying where your composition wins and how you can get to that point, because you're not always just going to be able to bum rush everyone and win all 3 lanes.